we're ready to get started here. Good afternoon. Last panel of the whole time. Hopefully you guys have been getting a lot out of everything. Our first speaker probably doesn't need an introduction because he's been around doing a lot for a long time in the tribal legal field. Eldrige Coochise from the Hopi Nation has been a tribal judge, has been on the board in North, has done all kinds of stuff for years and years. And also, maybe you don't know, but he's also a musician. He was just talking about his 5th album came out. Contained a lot of songs and recordings actually from 1969 even, and that just came out in July. So all-around guy here, all-around judge, coming up to talk. Eldrige Coochise.
Good afternoon, or in my case, good morning. Again, my name is Eldrige Coochise, retired judge now 16 years. Only thing I would advise you guys who are looking for retirement, don't do it. It's boring. And there's nothing that drives you nuts after working all those years until wee hours in the morning. You don't know what to do. Of course, I learned the better movies are on TV late at night, like 2 o'clock in the morning, especially the old Western movies. But I'm a member of the Hopi tribe with the Snake Clan, and I currently live in Phoenix after retirement. I moved out of Seattle so I could get warm again. So I've been doing some consulting. I sit at 3 courts right now on a pro tem basis, 2 in California and 1 in Arizona. And at least it helps my memory a little bit. So with the presentation today, they asked me if I want to go first or last. Normally I like to go last, but today I said, well, I'll go first. That way you guys can correct all that I missaid or is not correct, so that I'm not in trouble when I leave. But again, it's good to see you, and now we'll go through what we are assigned in the agenda. You have a copy of it, what we're supposed to cover. So with that, I think you can hear me all right, can't you? Can you hear me without a mic?
Yes.
I don't know how to talk without a mic. But again, peacemaking, I'm not so sure that's the correct title. It should be, I think it should be a traditional process. Peacemaking started out very much of everybody tried to get on the bandwagon with Navajo. And my colleague, the Chief Justice back at my college bench, he said, don't copy ours. One main reason, their peacemaking is based on their traditional process, the norms, the requirements, the responsibilities. So peacemaking, if you want to use that term, to me, I just say a dispute resolution form, but naming your tribes. Hopis had one. Even before our court system went into effect in 1942, the traditional process was already in place, although it's unwritten. How many of you here are from tribes, your own tribes where you work now? Can I see you then? Okay, we are becoming more minorities. Now, those of you who are not from the tribe, but you're working for tribes, one of the things that I would admonish or request or plead with is learn what the tribe's process is. Most cases, they already have a process. I left Hopi after 7 years and went to the Northwest. And of course, I never knew what a salmon was, except when it came in a little can. Because our reservation is 1.8 million acres, and we don't even have one body of water. So fishing is not something that I was accustomed to. So when I went to work up there, started working tribes, I spent my first 2 weeks, especially in a month, trying to sit down with elders and find out what process would you use. It's easy to implement the Western Anglo-Saxon court process that we pretty much bought into, but it doesn't help resolve. It's not set up to resolve problems. It's a win or lose situation. So if we can help individuals in Indian country, we need to look at what kind of process do we need so that we can help not only individuals, families, and communities. Most of us are related with, I live in Hopi and Phoenix, but we have 13 villages in Hopi. So it's hard to understand, well, what is it over here at Hopeville? What is it at First Mesa, where I'm from? Or what is it at Second Mesa? They're different. And the only thing we have to understand is what is going on that they worked with before 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which brought about the creation of tribal courts as we know it. And of course, the BIA gave everybody boilerplate. And to this day, I'm still surprised that 60% of the tribes still use the BIA boilerplate instead of having their own constitution. We're a little slow to change, but we are young as a court system. So with that, our task on traditional dispute resolution is to use as healing and growth so that we improve on the tribal sovereign power. Our task that you're here for, and most of us who are trying to assist, is to implement a peacemaking or other tribal dispute resolution process. You got to remember that traditionally, systems in place. Now, at Hopi, we never had a peacemaking, but we had a process. But our process in Indian country has always been a fixing, a result-oriented, until the Western Anglo-Saxon court system came in where you have a winner or a loser. And even then, victims are usually not assisted. More often, the government gets the money that they're fined. It doesn't go to people, most times not even to the victims who were either robbed or their property was destroyed or taken. So we're working in a system, but there are 2 important factors. And so that's what it's a step, this process to help your people in your Indian communities to reclaim the traditional ways that people use to resolve their disputes. It's not an easy task, but unless you learn it, you're not helping the community working. One of the things I just was aware of about a week and a half ago, 2 Hopis filed jointly for dissolution of marriage. Of course, when I was sitting there, there was no such thing as divorces, because in the Hopi way, divorce was not even a factor. People got married for life. But now they have it, and the thing of 2 things in yesterday's session that I was involved in is the cost for indigent individuals to use the process. Unfortunately, even at Hopi, in looking at our civil code, if you want to appeal a decision from the trial court, you have to post $25,000 to get your appeal. Most of us can't even afford it in 30 for 5 minutes. How are we going to afford it? And so when you start looking at it, we can't just bring outside process cost factors that we don't have or our people don't have. So the next one. Yeah. Traditional methods are generally dispute resolution forms that ensure that people could continue to live together and trust and rely on each other. Communities and families can be healed once you start that process. So if we're going to work in this arena, we need to be focused on what is the process that will do that. And that's why they're setting up this training session to help you understand and hopefully look at the process that they can use. Now, it says it's a step to reclaim or reclaim power, to do things that your people know best. Most of our people don't understand what court systems are. But if they have a problem, most of them know what needs to be done or how it can be done. You don't have to be legal trained to understand that. The reason is they know what's in their realm and how they can get along with their families and the community. So it's an act of sovereignty to reclaim the responsibility. You guys have that responsibility to assist our tribes in putting together a process. If it's not there, or if there is one there, and use it, but more important, the third one, do not try to bring somebody else's process to that tribe, because it may not fit, because it's under different rules, under different reasons, and the process is based on their traditional and, more important, on their religious process. Tribal sovereignty, as we understand it, based, and this is a good one from Warm Springs delegation a few years ago, on the laws of human beings, but on natural laws given by us, our Creator. And these natural laws are as they are, not as human beings may define them. And I've got that again from Warm Springs in Oregon. The foundation principles are that tribes are sovereign. Tribes became subject to legislative power in the United States, but they also retain a lot of their own powers and through congressional legislation and acts. And this you can find in David Getch's testimony before the U.S. Senate. And although we are part of the structure, and most of you are here on funds from probably the DOJ or other federal agencies, tribal court through the BIA. So even though we're part of it, it's important to know that the tribal authority was not created by the Constitution. Tribal sovereignty predated the U.S. Constitution and all the state constitutions. And this you can find in Charles Wilkinson's book in 1987. One of the big issues, no matter what process you're looking at or to implement or use it, you have to consider the Indian Civil Rights Act. Because that's one that covers all Indian country. And of course, it's an act of limitation on tribes' governments. It imposes on tribal governments. But I think the more critical is it mandates attached to provide due process within any process where you can exercise jurisdiction. And that's not just over tribal people or for tribal people. It's for everybody that comes on the reservation. Many of the tribes, even in the Northwest, where memberships were 1,000 to 4,000, almost 30–40% are non-members or non-Indians living in those reservations. So, depending on probably now what will be, even there get a lot of non-Indians living on their reservation. So, to understand what you have to have, besides considering the Bill of Rights, is jurisdiction. There's 3 types of jurisdiction. Personal, which is over people, persons. Do you have that? And second is the territory. How many of you here, your tribal location is a big land base of tribal land? How many of you live in the checkerboard area? the states that say this is reservation and this is not. So we've got a lot of issues, and it's defined in the federal regulations of what land area that the tribes have, and it should be in the constitution of each tribe. But the subject matter is the one that you really need to pay attention to. If you're working there, if you want to implement the system. Because that's one that gives the courts. And if you're a peacemaker, just say hello to the Alabama Quieroz peacemaker. Their authority to act in those cases is going to come based on the jurisdiction that comes in their code. So when you look at sovereignty, sovereignty is the power of American Indian tribes to make their own laws and be governed by those laws. It's not like the United States government, Congress. They make the laws, but they're not governed by it. And until recently, they were even subject to the federal legislation on different acts that they passed. We've got TLOA now since 2010, but the feds aren't subject to it. But you are, the tribe is. Wow, it's a delegation of power, but again, they can pass those. The problem is they don't give any resources to implement. So we have to find ways to deal with those, and it's the right of tribes to control their lands and the resources, and most important, the people who come onto those reservations. Now, in 1978, the criminal aspect really got taken away, because you were non-Indian, you were not subject to tribal court, even though it's on your land. So the Valhalla Act basically ran some of it back. TLO did in certain areas. So when you look at your organic documents, you need to understand, is it something we have, or do we have to wait on it? How do we deal with it? So the next step for all of us who work in this arena is to accept the responsibility. And so the question becomes, what can we do? So moving together, there's several things. One is to implement the traditional process. You can't do it if you don't know it. I found going to the Northwest, getting wet feet, that the elders are the ones that usually know the process. But I also learned that they will not say anything to you unless you ask for it. They've learned the hard way to try to inform their children and others, and nobody wants to listen to them. Oh, that's just your old ways. But to get what we want from this type of process, you need to find out what it is. A good example, when I took the bench at Hopi in 1974, we didn't have in the court system jurisdiction over children's cases. It went to the keeping week, the traditional leader, or the governor of each of the 13 villages. The court had no jurisdiction. And also, at that time, there was no divorce in Hopi. So I mistakenly wrote up a 4-page divorce ordinance, and the next day I got called before the council for 2 days, chewing out in a nice way, because we're kind of peaceful, we're really not renegades. I hope so. But the main thing is, it said we don't have that, and at that time still, there were many elders on our 17-member tribal council. And I got put in my place, they said, that is not here for voting. Once you marry someone, that's for life. There's no such thing as a divorce. So you have to know those issues. But the other real question is, Chairman said, Judge, who's going to interpret this law if we were to consider passing it? Nobody said anything except the 2 white attorneys in the back. They said, we're going to interpret it. And what are you going to interpret them? You're not Hopis. You don't understand the language. Oh, we're going to use the state because they have divorce codes all over the place. So again, it's important to know if it's to be your tribe's process, it has to be on the terms with the reasoning of the tribe itself, not the outside. In 1972, when Hopi passed their criminal ordinance, somebody just copied it from the state. And when I first looked at it, when I got in court, I looked, I said, well, this says Arizona. They forgot to take it off or write it out when they gave it to the council to pass. And they had such crazy things in there. First of all, Hopi, there is no street signs. We have two stoplights, basically. One on the east end, one on the west end, they're about 80 miles apart. In the code, it says you cannot drive on the road. If you have to have a red lantern on the back and a yellow one in the front. And things like you can't carry weapons in your car. Well, everybody carry a rifle on the back rack in pickup trucks. And so when you look at that in the complaint division, they said, well, where is it located? Well, we know where it's at. My dad's house is in First Mesa, just below two big water tanks, which aren't there anymore. So that's a landmark. But because we don't have the city type, a code that dictates or states what you can do and how, is not relevant. You've got to make it relevant to your tribal community. And I explained yesterday to the big crowd we had in our session, all four of you. That was great. That in Northwest, to hunt for salmon on the Columbia River, there are 3 tribes that had the rights to. In the same spot. It's just at different times of year. So those 3 tribes, Nez Perce, Yakima, and Warm Springs, you had to understand what is their practice. And not everyone can just go out there and fish. If you want to buy a pole, yes, and do like the outside, you try to catch it from the pole, they use nets. So again, all we're trying to say is, if it's going to be a traditional process, we need to find out what it is. A good example is, and those of you who are tribal members, you bring in attorneys to help you write codes. You need to sit down with them and say, this is not what we have here. Just like in Hopi, I don't know, the pro tem judge and the other pro tems, they did up the ordinance. And they redid a civil code. And then a week ago, a friend of mine filed for divorce, and they said, sorry, it's dismissed, you have not been residents for 90 days. So that's when I called the tribal secretary. I said, what's the civil code now? It was passed in August 2012. There's no requirement for residency. But even if it wasn't there, we as Hopis understand that the Hopi reservation is our permanent home. These 2 individuals work in Page for SRT Planaway. They couldn't drive from Hopi to Page every day. They both had homes at the different villages, one from Rogella and one from Mount Hopi. And they both have cornfields in their reservation. And so when you say you're not residents, no, wait a minute. Most of us in Indian country understand our permanent residence is where we're from. It's not like I learned for the last 20 years outside society. Your home is where you lay your head at night. So for 20-some years, my home was in the motels because that's where I laid my head. And that's what becomes ridiculous. So you need to work, we need to work within the current process, but again, more important, what is the tribe's process? It's not easy to find out. And if you don't go seeking it, you're going to be Same mistakes that our new current judges got appointed, dismiss a divorce case as residency. No 90 days, that's a state requirement. We know that, but it's not a Hopi. And Hopis are enrolled members. They have access to the tribal court. But more importantly, they're permanent residents. And so, unless you understand that just to go to the book, you're not going to help. And as my colleague years ago, Chief Justice Tom Sowell, we went to the Harvard Law School to talk about traditional, along with Janet Reno, who was Attorney General there. And he verbally said, don't copy our ways, because your process is not really included in your religious or your traditional or family process. You've got to base your process, whether you call it peacemaking, whether you call it dispute resolution, or just a tribal process, which this is a Hopi, just a tribal process to deal with disputes. Then you need to don't use the outside. You can look at it. When we look at every state of the code, doesn't mean we have to adopt that one. Okay. So if sovereignty is the power of American Indians to make their own laws and be governed by those laws, and it's the right of tribes to have control over their lands, resources, and the people who come onto the reservations, then going back, we would go backwards. Yeah. Okay, keep going. No, you're going backwards now. I'll be covered it. The last slide should be, yeah, this one. Thank you for your time here, and please take it seriously, accept the responsibility if you're going to work in our country. But in doing so, don't bring outside into learn what the tribe's process is. My way of learning when I moved to the Northwest is to go to, of course, with a real positive factor. I went to every senior citizen's lunch. Because there they talk to you. And so I said, what are you going to do if this happens? Well, what if this happens? And they just go on and say, well, this is how it's done. These are persons or entities that handle it. It wasn't written anywhere. And so, of course, I'm in a lot of ways eating all senior meals, but because they were nice of me to give me 2 plates instead of 1. So now's the time for you. Some of us are kind of used up our time, I would say, to implement a traditional process, but do it based on what you're at Alabama or in North Dakota or Wisconsin. And Wisconsin's like Northwest. The biggest issue up there is hunting and fishing. So, but you've got to understand what the process is and how that's going to work. And subject matter again is what is acceptable for you in the court system, you or as a peacemaker can handle. Because 2 years before I retired in the Northwest, I got called before the council with late. I said, what did I do wrong or what did we do wrong? Judge, why did you let your associate judge accept jurisdiction and transfer of a child to the tribe? We don't have an ordinance for that. We didn't want the court to have that ordinance. Let the state take care of it. They have the money, we don't. And so you need to be careful and mindful that some of the subject matter areas may not exist on paper. But generally the traditional process, it's there, you just have to research and understand what they are. So to all of you, I'm glad to see your interest is in helping our people and not impose penalties like what we did. You couldn't appeal $25,000. I don't even make that all year anymore since I retired. So I just better keep my nose clean. Indian attorneys come out, it takes us 2 years to even get you close to understand what we are or who we are, if you're willing to learn. So, again, thank you, and God bless you too. Oh, we can still pray in our tribal, even the council pray. And that's one of the things under the Civil Rights Act, different in the U.S. Constitution. We're allowed to have a tribal religion, but United States or states are not. That's one of the factors. The one that hampers us in tribal courts is always the penalty issue. It used to be 6 months in jail, or $500 until 1986 when the feds went in a war against drugs, and they raised $1,000 a year in jail. Now in 2010, TLOA, they raised it 3 years or $15,000 per issue. So it's getting up, but it's not always the best policy. In the traditional process, even in those criminal cases, they can deal with it at home and bring. Remember, one of the things that is purported in all the years I've been going to training is how do we bring people back into the local community? When you put them in jail, it doesn't do that. Our Hopi religion is a year-long process. If they're sitting in jail for a year, they've lost any input or any working within the religious process, especially if the Chinuan starts in January till July when they go home. So when you understand some of those processes, it'll be easier for you to look at, and it doesn't have to be very long. And like what my own counsel told me, don't write it down, just know what it is. And then if you leave and your predecessor, make sure that they understand what the process is. So again, good luck and thank you for your interest in our tribal leaders.
Hopefully, something that's come through the way that we structured all of this is that there's opportunities to implement your traditional ways all along the process, anywhere within the process of justice. You can do it up front, you can do it at the end, you can do it in sentencing, you can do it in reentry. There's all these different points, and so it's really up to you and the people who work with you about where you're going to basically act as sovereigns, where you're going to bring the Indianness into what you're doing, back into what you're doing. We've adopted a mainstream model more so. And that's what sovereignty is all about. I mean, it's about acting sovereign. It's about doing things the way that you want to do. Your people doing things the way that they want it to be done, the way that works for them. And that's what it really is. It's hard to keep that in mind sometimes because the imposed systems, basically the IRA systems and the corresponding court systems, do come from the outside. And if you see colonization as basically oppression, the oppression is really complete when the oppressor can walk away and the people keep the system on autopilot because you've taught them so well. I mean, if you study oppression studies in all Paulo Freire and other people who have studied oppressed cultures, that's a common theme. Oppression is complete when the oppressor can leave and the people continue to act out on themselves. Well, guess what? Lateral violence is a big factor in that when you have a violently oppressive system like we've had implemented on Native people for a long time. And I would argue we're not getting a whole lot of oppression from the outside anymore, but we've got some pretty oppressive conditions at home for a lot of us. Still. And so the trick is how do you snap out of that and start moving in a more self-directed way. And even self-determination was, while it's a step towards running our own affairs, it's also, initially at least, it was a step towards taking over that same system again, right? And doing it the way that the feds are doing it for us or on our behalf at our homes. So that's, self-determination was self-governance was a step in a positive direction where we could start to reprogram funds a little bit and start to, tinker with the mix. But a really sovereign act would be to just say, hey, we're going to start doing stuff the way we want to and insert that in this justice system at different places where we think that it's going to be easiest for us to get that in place and move on to another one later. So hopefully you've gotten all sorts, the sense that there's all sorts of options, all sorts of ways that you can do it, ways that you can introduce your ways of doing things at different points in the system. And you can exercise your sovereignty kind of at all levels too. I mean, you can take it at a big level, you can take it at small levels. You can look at families, you can look at processes. It's just, there's a wealth of opportunity, and there's enough tribes who have been pursuing this long enough to where there's usually an example for anything you might be considering, at least something close. You can look and learn from mistakes and how stuff has worked for other people. One of the best sparks of insight I think that I had was Judge Polly today said that part of what she likes to do is she likes to focus on trying to teach the law to speak Indian. And to me that struck me as like, that's sovereignty right there. We're really just trying to take what we have for the law and trying to teach it to think through native eyes again or through the native language. And so that, to me, that's sovereignty in action. Teaching the law, teaching our courts to speak Indian again, to speak whatever tribal language it is that the court's operating within. And isn't that all of our tools we're looking at these processes? And yeah, we call it peacemaking, we can call it a traditional dispute process or a dispute resolution system. It's all about trying to view the world again through eyes that saw it through the language that our ancestors spoke. And luckily, some of our elders speak too in some cultures. Those languages grew up with an understanding of the world and the relationships between people and the world around them. That was purposefully attempted to be exterminated for a long time. And so now we're in a process, we're at a point in history where we're trying to gain that back. I would argue that that's a spiritual notion. I'd argue that that's the world trying to achieve balance again. And imbalance happened over here, and it disrupted the way that humans acted, the way that we placed ourselves in the world. And it tried to take away the tools that we use, like language, to understand that way of being in the world. And so now, maybe we've gotten through that, and we're trying to get that balance back in that way. It's really kind of a deep thing. And this is a really nice way to conceptualize it in the field that we're all concerned with here is to teach those laws to speak Indian. We're going to talk to you guys after this session and hopefully hear a little bit about what you got out of all of this too, because we need some feedback on
First, though, we wanted to draw together the best we could, tell you what we think happened here, like we're doing, and give you the benefit of some insight from over the years, basically, in the trenches since early Indian law days. With that, Shawn's going to come up next and provide a last little nice piece of analysis.
So I'm going to use the microphone because I don't know if you get a chance to rock the mic, so I've got to take advantage of that. So Ian back here was in my class at Columbia this last year, and the kind of major focus of the class, besides the service piece, is sovereignty and what that means in relation to the traditional dispute resolution methods. And part of what I think is difficult is we talk about sovereignty in a way that I think we often, because it's not a fun thing to talk about, right? We miss the traumatic piece of our sovereignty, and that's that piece where, according to the U.S. federal government and according to the Supreme Court, we're not actually sovereigns. We are semi-sovereign, domestic, dependent nations, and that's problematic because what that means is we are not entities unto ourselves as we once were. We've lost that piece. It was taken from us. It wasn't, when I say we lost it, it's not like I forget my keys, right? I can't find my keys because my kids are missing. That piece was taken from us, and we have, over time, had that sovereignty whittled away. And it shouldn't be any shock to anyone that the Baby Veronica decision was a very thinly veiled recognition by the Supreme Court that maybe the federal government is trying to erode even more of our sovereignty, because that case comes down to the Supreme Court saying we don't actually think the Cherokee Nation is qualified to decide who's a member of the Cherokee Nation. And so when I start to think about what's happened to our sovereignty over time and where I see it heading as we start to move into the future with a Supreme Court who is hostile to Indian interests, I start to think about what are some of the ways we can wrest back some of what we've lost. And I think that traditional dispute resolution, peacemaking, that is a way that we can wrest back some of that sovereignty through tradition, through culture, and through example. So one of the things that Judge Coochise has said in the two panels that I've had the blessing to be a part of with him was that maybe it's not even right to call it peacemaking. That's the Navajo word. Maybe the best thing to do is call it whatever it is that you call it, that your tribe calls it, that your people call it. I think Cheryl Fairbanks talked yesterday about one of the big kind of points of decision around do you remember which tribe she was talking about saying that for? Maybe it was Alabama Coushatta, or no, maybe it was Pachanga. She was talking about one of the big kind of pieces was, what are we going to call this? And they came up with a name that fit, that was them. And so one of the pieces of this traditional dispute resolution that you can do is that it's the opportunity for your tribe, for your people, for your system to create something that is uniquely and fundamentally of your people. So not as a model of the Anglo courts, not as a model of what the Navajo do, but what is it that makes your people unique? What is it that makes your people a culture worth holding on to, worth preserving, worth going out and trying to seek that sovereignty back, try to wrest back as much of it as you can? And so this traditional dispute resolution methods gives you the opportunity to do that. One of the things that I find really interesting is we've sort of been thrown a little bit of a bone through the reauthorization of VAWA and TLOA, these laws where we say, well, all right, Indians, you can have some of this back, but you have to go through this long procedures of checks and compliances to make sure that you're doing it the way that we would do it if we were doing it ourselves instead of giving it back to you. And I hope that there's an opportunity for tribes who are going to pursue retaining some of the jurisdiction over those two statutes. I hope there's an opportunity for those tribes to sneak in part of the way that they're going to deal with offenses committed by non-Indians on Indian land. I hope there's an opportunity to sneak in, putting people through a process that's traditional to you. You're right, and Judge Coochise is right. That's going to be limited by the ICRA and any other number of federal statutes that are designed to make sure that Indian due process looks exactly like Anglo due process. But I still think there's an opportunity to sneak these kinds of dispute resolution methods in when we're talking about how we're going to deal with people who come from off the reservation and commit offenses on the reservation, where we decide we want to take that back. So I think, this is an opportunity for us to really expand our sovereignty in a way that we might not have had before. Because, it's something that we have to be extra protective of, and it's something that I think causes a lot of conflict in Indian country. I know there are issues out there where Indian country is divided. I think payday loans is probably one of those issues, because I can see anyway, it looks to me like the way that those things are progressing through the courts, that there's a hammer out there waiting to be dropped by the federal government because they don't like what's happening, the way that the abuses that happen through those loans occur. And so instead of taking opportunities to put our sovereignty as a tribal community in peril. And I know we're not a monolith, right? Indians aren't a monolith. That's part of why this conference and traditional peacemaking and so forth is interesting, because it's a chance, as we were saying before, for each tribe to create its unique system. It's something that works for their people. But for the purposes of the government, we are a monolith. It's just called federal Indian law. There's no federal Navajo law, and no federal Cherokee law, and no federal Quechua law. It's just called federal Indian law. So when we're making decisions for our individual tribes, we also have to be mindful that the decisions that we make will affect the monolith that the federal government sees. And so here's an opportunity to bring some of that back, to wrest some of that control back, to lead by example, to create something that will be meaningful to the people and meaningful to Indian country at large. And I think for the people that have been here, we hope that this has been useful to you in giving you some sort of help in trying to decide what you might do if you're going to do something, or helping in trying to help you figure out where you might tweak what you have, or just helping knowing where to go to ask questions. And it's certainly been my privilege to get to be a part of this. I forget, because I live in the Northeast now, how good it feels to be around Indian people. I don't get that like I did growing up. I certainly grieve for my girls because they don't get it growing up. And I think when people get together, when Indians get together, this is the kind of stuff, this is the kind of goodwill that can come out of it. We can all be better as individual nations because of the way we come together as a sort of larger community and can make things better for ourselves. I think I have been blessed to get to meet a bunch of people I didn't meet before, and to hear people like Judge Coochise talk. When Cheryl comes back in for this session, I can feel free to tell her I said this. I have a total professional crush on her now. She is, for me, the absolute definition of an advocate. She possesses the ability to speak up for Indians and Indian ways of thinking and Indian ways of behaving in a way that is not adversarial or off-putting or aggressive. That is not a talent or skill I possess. It is one I deeply desire to possess. And seeing Cheryl at work is an absolute inspiration to me. And I hope that some of what we've done here has been, if not inspirational, it's useful to you. And we thank you guys all for being here and sharing your knowledge and your time and your expertise with us and helping us think better about how we're doing what we do too. So I think we wanted to take some time to answer some questions that you had, and then at the end we can wrap up and get some feedback from you guys about what this process has been like for you and things that you might change or just ways to help out. So if you have questions, please let us know.
Well, when you said, sneak in some ways to get back some authority that can slowly erode it away, this don't sound like a radical, like we take our government into trouble. To sneak back some of those things, and I was just thinking, one of the trips we made was to the Hopi reservation up there in Northern California. And their school there has a lot of non-Indian kids there, because the next public school is 50 or 80 miles down the road, so kids go there to the Hopi school. And they have to go to the Hopi court. And the violations there are things like truancy and marijuana and stuff like that, because marijuana use is illegal for minors on the federal land. So they're doing that right now, and people are going to the Peacemaking court like that. Can you name some examples maybe where a different type of reservation can think of some where we could say take it back, where we have non-members all over the reservation, and probably most of them, some creative ways to have dispute resolution with, when you have conflicts for say an Indian, non-Indian, domestic violence, that kind of stuff. And if it's non-Indian, they get off scot-free in a lot of ways.
Okay.
Just a couple things popped to my mind that you may have thought of. One is consent always, right? So step into the peacemaking process and just get them to sign a consent form. And you could tinker with your tribal code where you would claim personal jurisdiction over non-Indians within the confines of the reservation. Of course, you run the risk of rubbing against federal law.
They might not know that.
Exactly. I've made protection orders stick, no problem. I didn't have jurisdiction in the court to do it. The judge and I just kind of let it go because the guy needed to be dealt with. And so we scared him. I put a protection order on him. We didn't have jurisdiction. So it can happen. Probably nobody report me to the bar. I don't know if that's legal.
The NSA's got no problem.
Well, they talk about there's consent. When Justice Shawn and I were both in the bench, I was a Hopi, he was Navajo, when Oliphant came down in 1978. So for 6 months, we, along with other associates and a couple of the state judges, we did up a consent form. But we ran into problems and basically not dealing with the court, but what the reasons we stopped it is because we were informed that you can do it, but what if these same people, non-Indians, come back 10 years later and say, well, you really didn't have jurisdiction, so you couldn't let us consent? Then you would be, the tribe would be subject to pay the money back and interest. And so that's when we did away with the consent. Most people at Hopi or Navajo would rather come to our courts, tribal courts, than go to state. 2 reasons. Again, it's money is, one is the distance to the county courts. Second is the cost of having to take a day off to go to Holbrook or Gallup or Flagstaff to go to court. And the other one really had to do with the carrying out whatever they had agreed to in the consent. Because normally when we got that consent, we did, in the criminal cases and traffic, we did certain sentencing. But most people who are non-Indians and live in our land would rather come, and because they feel like they're part of the community. One of the things that's a downfall with the tribes in the Northwest, we got non-Indians to start singing in the trees. And they were more willing to set than a lot of the Indian people because they knew the system. So when you look at those factors And we sat down and both with two federal judges, said, if you don't have the jurisdiction, how can you give consent? So that's a problem we ran into, and I don't know, you may find that at Utah or other areas as well. But certainly there are ways that they can deal with it, and in the civil arena, it's still wide open. There's really nothing a no to the jurisdiction. So a lot of tribes go away from the criminal traffic and made it a civil incident.
Oh, we have more jurisdiction in civil.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, you actually mentioned a piece there in the question itself that was it's a fantastic idea, which is you've got these school students participating in the process. And of course, one of the major pieces of any colonial culture is to get the young people and just de-culturate them. So you make it illegal for them to speak their language, or you make it painful for them to speak their language. You remove them from their culture and place them with families of the colonial culture. So you just sort of kind of steal the Indianness from us in some level. But that's a tactic that can work for us in reverse, right? So if we can start to, if you're going back to your tribes now and starting a peacemaking program, or if you already have a thriving peacemaking program, if you can get dispute resolution into your schools at as low a level as possible, put the culture and sort of that important aspect of it aside from, if you can teach young people how to resolve conflicts amongst themselves without having to resort to violence or rely on a third party to pass judgment upon them, if you can teach young people how to take control of their own conflicts, how to decide for themselves what's a harm, how to decide for themselves what feels like an adequate remedy, how to decide for themselves to come to a community and solution with the people around them, you will head off some of the social ills that your tribe may face, certainly that America at large faces. You can head those problems off 10 or 15 years before they even start. And so getting peacemaking, traditional dispute resolution methods, giving them the vocabulary, the skills training, the language, everything that they need to sort of work through that on their own, that's one way to start at the bottom and just build that as a piece of culture all the way up through adulthood. And so that by the time, before anyone notices, you've had a generation or two go by, and there it is, like your culture's back, your dispute resolution methods are back, because those children don't grow up thinking, I need to go to court to solve the dispute resolution I have. Or maybe I can just avoid court by beating up this person or whatever. So that's another way to, I think, sneak it in there on the slide.
Reverse colonialism?
Yeah, it's good vocabulary. We'll use reverse colonialism. Yeah, for sure. Other questions?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say you really have provided some very good information. I really appreciate that personally. The one question I had was, all this good information on this PowerPoint, will that be available online?
I don't know, but you can just email me and I'll send it to you. Or if you want a copy, I've got my laptop and printer up in my room.
Okay. I'd like to get that PowerPoint.
Yeah. Or you can have the one I worked on.
So I think what we're going to do is try to collect the materials that the panelists have been willing to share and post them on Brett's NARC website. So that's narf.org, right?
Yeah, and then /peacemaking. It's on the little half-page color flyer that's out there too. But I want you to be in touch personally too. Anybody can email me with whatever, and I'll do my best to get it to you too. And then Nikki said that Nigel's going to put something up too that has to do with a Dropbox. For those of you who are familiar with that technology, I'm not so hot at Dropbox yet, but I will be, because that's how you share big files. And I know that Cheryl's PowerPoint was a really big file, so she had trouble emailing that. So that's why we said we're going to have to do a Dropbox thing. Of course, we can still mail flash drives to people, and that's what it takes to share the info with you. That's part of what our service is all about, is just getting information out to everybody who needs it. So be in touch. If nothing else, just call me in our old-fashioned way. Even use a rotary phone if you want to be that old-fashioned. Whatever works, you know. Telepathy, I'm not so good at. I'm not that much of an elder yet, so.
Well, they might have a rotary phone downstairs at the diner. All the whole stuff I know works down there. But one question, how many of you work at tribes or from tribes that still have the clans alive and well? Can I see your hands? Clans that operate or live and still alive today? Okay, not very many of you. But what I really wanted to address is, at Hopi we have 43 different clans. And each of the clans also have different responsibilities. So those of you who still have clans, find out which clan would be, have the authority or responsibility to deal with this type of dispute resolution or to address issues that are, because when I first got asked to be on the bench, I'm from the Snake clan, and I was 15 minutes after I talked to the council, I had my dad and several members in the back said, "Albert, you can't sit on the court." I said, "Okay." "Why?" "Because you're not in the clan that can deal with judging other people. A lot of our clans, you have law enforcement responsibilities, you have this type of fixing issues, or you got responsibilities over land." So it took about 3 months for my own family and distant family and clan leaders to say, okay, to the chairman so he could appoint me. So that's important. If you still have that, it's good. Go to that clan or member who's responsible for dealing with people and how to work and solve no matter what the problem is.
I wanted to ask how you make the shift back towards the traditional dispute resolution process. Where I come from, we seem to be engaged and moving towards more the adversarial American system. We're sort of like slow, and which I think is good in some ways, slow in developing certain systems, one of which was the tribal court system, and that came in probably in my own pueblo maybe 5 years ago. We now have what's called a contemporary court, whereas before the governors were the arbiters. So we bought into it, and we really bought into it. It's punitive. And so how do you start the conversation about making the shift back? That's where I would like to start that conversation from where I come from.
It's easy. In the 32 years I was on the bench, it really is easy. Especially once I got out of my own home area, Hopi. When I went to the Northwest, they were fighting over fishing issues, which I had no idea what it was anyway. But one of the things you always want to do, and don't ignore it, it's not easy, but to approach your council, tribal councils, or your board of directors, or whatever their term is, both individually and saying, we have this problem. And that's why when I went in, I had 13 issues that people had. And they didn't want to come to court because they said, judges wouldn't understand that anyway. They're not from here. So that's the easiest thing to do, find out and say, okay, what do we have? What's the problem here? Can we resolve it under law and order code or whatever? And then just start talking. Go to lunch with somebody, or just go to, if your family is one of the members that tied into the council, go to them and set it up. That's the easiest way I found to do it.
Many of the photos that you know do not look. You don't have a voting system. And the other aspect of that is that women are not, you know, I guess you could say allowed to be in the government, the leadership systems. So I'm not trying to create barriers. I'm just trying to, figure out within this context how to, our trial. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I understand that. It was in my lifetime that women finally got to be on council. And even today, we have splits in families because the women got on council. It's just things that have to change over time, unless you're from India or one of those countries where you don't have to say it all. But most of the time, today, there's somebody on your leadership that will listen to you and then go with it. Especially when you present, well, these are coming before the court, and I don't think it can be resolved within the formal court process. And that's what I had to do in the Northwest with 15 tribes, because I had no idea how they even lived and what they did. I know what we did at Hopi, but even there, when we had issues like people wanting to divorce, I just went to the council. Of course, they had a nice 2-day education process along with you chewed out, but you need to take that step and address that with who you know is in the leadership. Maybe they're new members. Elections are coming up everywhere. Some every year, some 2 years, and some 4 years. Go to those individuals who are running and ask them if they would consider if they get elected. Besides, if you promise them you'll vote for them if they do it. You don't have money, so they'll still do it. That's only one of the suggestions I have. And I've worked with them and got results from it.
I want to throw that question out to the rest of the audience too to answer. Is, any other peacemakers who can help with some ideas about how to get the discussion started, given that our tribal court seems to be gung-ho on the imposed system? Surely some of you have sparked the discussions in your communities.
I would just ask how that's working for them. Ask them how that's working for them. Is it working to the good of the people? Is it working for the good of the individuals? Is it working for the good of the community? And if they really look at it, they'll probably see that it's not. And that's the opening to propose something different.
I can't offer any help, but you and I had this discussion yesterday, and I came away wondering, I guess I have some naive assumption that you must still have elders who know the old ways. And it seems if you do, knowing where you're from, what you told me, if you do have that still intact, that there must be something there that could be brought back.
I would just simply repeat what I said this morning, and that's about avoiding the destructive effects of the adversarial model, which I think is significant for any tribal community. And then secondly, the duty to develop tools that are going to be effective and meaningful. To me, that's bottom line. And it seems like those ought to be persuasive to some.
think sometimes we can be our worst enemies. You know, we might look at a system and a process, like you're talking about having a traditional process before. Maybe there was some outside entity that came in and says, no, in order for you to succeed, you have to adopt this other process. Then you've got the Bureau with their funding mechanisms for tribal courts, statistics, you have to always have your numbers ready, and you have to, you know, make sure that you get adequate funding by complying with their requirements for whatever formulas they have to establish funding. And so the funding mechanisms that they have for courts are based on adversarial models. And so one of the things I think we also have to look at is not only working internally to adjust our system, our judicial system to embrace peacemaking, but also to look externally, to look at the funding mechanisms and the protocols that the Bureau has and law enforcement and Office of Justice Services, so that if a tribe chooses to embrace peacemaking, that these external forces understand how important that is to each specific tribe and has some type of formula in place and mechanism in place so that they can also fund law enforcement, tribal courts, whatever services they fund to assist tribes, so that this peacemaking process has to also be embraced and acknowledged by the funding sources that give money to tribes. You know, instead of looking at piecemealing and grants, etc., we need to also look at making it something that's always going to be there. You know, schools, you know, you talk about, I just heard somebody talking about, you know, like any problems that we might have in schools, like truancy and fighting and conflicts in school and dealing with it there. You know, why don't we have something in place from the Office of Education where they're going to fund projects like this, and then once they're successful, you know, acknowledge that it's something that's going to be there forever and make it part of your funding cycle. So, you know, it's like a two-pronged thing. You work internally to change it back, because I think that's what we're all talking about. You know, we all had a process before. We need to re-embrace that. And most of us are, even without peacemaking programs, if you have judges with a mind and a heart, they're going to embrace it already naturally. But what we have to do is not only make it part of our entire protocol in court, various aspects of court, but also make it a protocol in our schools, our probation offices, even in law enforcement. And get all those entities to understand that this is what we want, this is what we need, this is how we're going to make ourselves strong. And then embrace that, but we also have those external entities that we have to educate and convince that this is what process we need to make or take. This is the road we've chosen. You need to realize that, and you need to help us and make it permanent. And that's what we have to look at. So, but I think Pueblo, you know, that they have a lot going for them already. And if they've taken this turn, you can always turn back and go back where you came from.
Now, I don't know how qualified I am to give you any advice, but just listening to everything I've heard over the past 2 days, maybe you could try going at it from a different approach. So rather than looking at it from, you know, women can't be leaders and you don't vote for people, so you can't kind of get your in that way. Maybe to look at it from the perspective of how you can get it in. Like, forgive me, Shawn stated, they did work with a tribe where they went through all their codes and everything and found one little piece where they said that they could rely on traditional ways. Maybe you could look and find something that is in your written law or something from some of the elders that has something, so you could use that as some backing. And then try to get support from some of the male leaders in your community. So try to just look at it from not from the things that restrict you, but the things that can assist you to move forward.
Excuse me. I just wanted to share something from the Ojibwe perspective, and maybe this, everybody's kind of alluding to this, that with within the Western system where the male is a superior being, and then the Western people coming into our ways and shifting things so that it goes along with the idea of the male superiority. With the Ojibwe in our ceremonies, the men do all the talking, but the women, they sit and they watch what the men do. And if the men are doing something they shouldn't be doing, then they call them over and say anything, or say something. Or if something needs to be given to the people that are at the ceremony, it's the male who will do the talking, but they're saying what the woman is telling them to do. So from that, for my own thinking or feeling, the strength of a woman is recognized in every nation. So I'm just wondering if you maybe look back and somewhere 200 years ago or something like that, the shift happened, where the Western people came in and were able to coerce or whatever the change in your own practices. So I just wanted to share that.
I have an additional thought that reminded me of something that I've learned over the years, and we have Navajo friends in the audience, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that I learned fairly early on when I made site visits there are these concepts of justice that I talked about this morning are embodied in their creation stories. And I don't know for Pueblos or others whether they can use that source of authority to gain whatever ground needs to be gained.
There's a couple of responses. First to the gentleman regarding the funding. Yeah, we're going to get funding through for courts. One of the ways you can probably put it within your budget, and you mentioned you have to have numbers, is not to call it peacemaking, but say an alternative to solve crime or issues on a reservation. And the reason I say that, when I went to the Northwest, because they were pretty new, we had to develop codes. Well, we went to DOJ, they said, well, you have a maximum 3 years, you can get money for code development. Well, along the way, somebody told me, well, that's what it says, and that you have to do something different. So we just learned to change the same language, and I've got 11 years funding for code writing development. It's just how you make your requests in those applications that it can be done. And certainly with this other process, you could include it under the law enforcement, because you know it's going to help law enforcement, especially family disputes. I've been a policeman before, and most of us officers do not like to go into a domestic fight. Because no matter which side you try to help, the other turns on you, or they both turn on you. So you could put it into that process of looking for dollars. Just call it an alternative. Once you develop that, then you can call it whatever you want. That's one of the suggestions, the comment you made, because they always want numbers. And the problem with all these, even the recent acts, that tribes have the authority or granted authority, nobody puts any money for it. It's kind of like your VA people, veterans. We'll send you off to war, but we're not going to fix you when you get back and you're crippled and hurt. The money doesn't come to that. And so you have to learn how to put together your proposals and modify them so it fits within their criteria. And then to Pueblo, I'm not Hopi, we're Pueblos. And it's interesting, my dad was on the council for years. And I sat and watched him, and my uncle was the chairman, and a couple others. Every council meeting I attended, and I attended a lot of them, I'd sit and no action was taken at the table. Well, they get home, and then like my mom's cooking, and then she'll ask my dad, what did you guys talk about today? And then she'd go over what her thoughts were. And I went to my uncle, who was at she cooked with him. He went home, and his mother, during dinner time, she told him, well, you guys could have done this one. And you know what? Those men went back to council meeting, and they voted according to what their wives told or their mothers in council meeting the next day. I don't know if they still do that, but it was interesting that the men were the only ones at that time on the councils, but it was the women who had the power to do anything. And that was just when they made their determinations over making dinner work and dinner hours. So if you make those changes, you have to find ways that it can be done. And as far as going after money, I've spent 20 years on a hill seeking money for the courts. And a number of my colleagues from Niger, we spent 7 straight years to get one bill passed to get money. Still no money on it, but other money is coming to the other sources. And so when you look at what you're trying to do, be careful what you name it, because it may be offensive to the federal government to fund those. Make it conducive to what they would be willing to do. And that, it can work.